Hi, Dr. Kim. This is my second video journal, and for question number 1, the 3 individuals that I believe deserve more recognition for their contributions to civil rights activism are Ella Baker, Noel Day, and Charles Sims. In regard to Ella Baker, she was a longtime civil rights activist and the key founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was known as SNCC. She was a longtime civil rights activist. She was involved in the NAACP as well as the acting associate director for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In this position, she differed with the idea of charismatic leadership and instead believed that leadership should be centered around the group. It should be more egalitarian in nature. She firmly believed that strong people did not need strong leaders. In this regard, she wanted to involve ordinary people in making decisions that affected their own lives and thus minimize the hierarchy of leadership, and in this way call for direct action as well. And drawing upon these experiences, she encouraged college students to form their own independent organization, which was SNCC. During her time shaping their organization, she used the Socratic method of leadership to engage students to express their own point of views and make sure that everybody's voice was heard. And she also involved direct action and community involvement to thus bring even more voices to the table for discussion. I think she's important because it really shows that individuals can be empowered to make a difference in their own lives, and that by using the talents of the group, you can really have a strong organization. In regard to Noel Day, he was a teacher who designed much of the curriculum for the Mississippi Freedom Schools and other freedom schools around the United States. As a teacher, he believed that caring about his students was far more important than using any particular methodology in his teaching. With that being said, he did design lessons plans that would deal with the inexperience of the Freedom Schools volunteer teachers, while also maintaining the commitment to encouraging critical thinking in young people in order to convince them to become active in the civil rights movement. To do this, he designed his curriculum to include discussions about the merits of mainstream American culture, Black culture, and freedom movement alternatives. And through these questions, students would be allowed to see the inequality as being a political entity rather than a physical entity. Another unit that he designed demonstrated that the conditions in the North and the South were essentially the same in regard to being terrible, and that racial stereotypes instilled irrational fears and poor rights, thus leading towards systematic oppression. By linking knowledge to the struggle of freedom, he hoped that these lessons would encourage involvement in the civil rights organization, thus continuing the long practice of using education to empower people. For Charles Sims, he was the head of the Bogalusa, Louisiana chapter of the Deacons for Defense. This was an armed self-defense group that its job was to protect civil rights activists. Although they did not believe in starting fights preemptively, they believed that they should fight back together if they were attacked or other civil rights activists were attacked. However, this did not mean that they were against nonviolence. In fact, Charles Sims believed that political and economic progress could only happen through nonviolence. And because of this, he wanted to protect other nonviolent civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and the Meredith March Against Fear in Mississippi. Because he believed that armed self-defense complemented civil rights activism, he felt that he could do a lot of good in this and empower the African American community to stand up for themselves and not take the violence. With that being said, he did not condone Black power, as he still believed in working with others in order to instill real change. For question 2, SNCC and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference did have some similarities in terms of their communication strategies. SNCC used the media to promote their platform of civil rights and to build a grassroots community. In its early stages, SNCC believed in forming a beloved community and winning people over through Christian ideals and pacifism. In addition to distributing its own publications, SNCC worked with the national media to garner support for its cause. This was done through staging sit-ins and protests that attracted the press, thus garnering popular support and maybe even federal intervention by exposing inequalities of the South. A good example of this would be in Freedom Summer, when SNCC would publicize the violence that was happening against the activists that were down there, and these images and stories were broadcast on the national news, thus instilling outrage in the general public that such actions were allowed to go on. And this won support for their cause, and also in many cases encouraged the federal government to act because of popular outrage. In addition to this, SNCC also released press statements to the media, and under its communications director, Julian Bond, ensured that the organization had its own unique identity. SNCC wanted to make sure that people knew that it was SNCC doing these civil rights actions and not another organization, and this would allow them to get adequate funding as well. In addition to courting the national news media, SNCC released its own publications to bypass some biases that were present and to allow their own story to be told unfiltered. This would educate and empower young activists and also mobilize them to act. Similar to SNCC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference also needed to win public opinion in order to succeed in their causes. Their public relations would include building alliances, using grassroots communication, and political action. So all of those are very similar to SNCC in terms of they wanted people to become civil rights activists. They wanted people to get involved. Also similar to SNCC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference under MLK knew that nonviolence would win the day, and they used almost like a media show to demonstrate the battle between good and evil that was civil rights. They knew that nonviolence would put them in a good light, that they would be seen as the innocent people that were being ruthlessly attacked for just exercising their rights. Hence, the public would side with them and turn against the racists. Through this use of image building, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference won over for public support. Although the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and SNCC were very similar in terms of their public relations strategies in the early days, SNCC would eventually take a more militant turn. After Bond's resignation, a man by the name of Charles Cobb took over as its communications director, and SNCC shifted to Black power in terms of its message. During this period, the national press was deemed to be expendable, and instead, SNCC activists cultivated Black media outlets and held press meetings in Black neighborhoods. Because SNCC was no longer accessible to the national news media, it was mistakenly called a communist organization, and many white people were alarmed at their more militant actions. Although this did assist African Americans in developing racial consciousness, it alienated white America. As a result, you can see that this more militant anti-work together ideal of late SNCC differed subtly with the more mainstream media techniques of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In regard to question 3, feminism and women's contributions within civil rights organizations did impact positively the civil rights movement. Despite being ignored by the media, women's contributions to the civil rights movement were key in building consensus, sustaining communities, and nurturing freedoms for individuals, organizations, and the nation. Because SNCC's emphasis was on building communities and establishing them, as well as encouraging grassroots activism, many women found a place where they could excel in this organization through more feminine, nurturing roles that were supported and encouraged through a more group-based, egalitarian style of leadership. For example, in the Albany, Georgia Freedom Rides, Casey Hayden served as an observer. In this role, she would alert SNCC or the Justice Department or the press that activists were arrested. However, because this role was discreet, her and people like her, their roles were not necessarily broadcast to the general public, but they were still vitally important to the organization in terms of getting help for their activists, as well as ensuring that the media was on hand to see what was going on. With this more emphasis on more nurturing in women's roles, it's unsurprising that SNCC was founded by a woman, Ella Baker. With her background in the NAACP, she abandoned their idea of recruiting the talented tenth of professionals in favor of convincing ordinary people that they could enact change, thus keeping with the feminist ideal of building communities and establishing grassroots activism. While serving as the acting associate director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Baker came across the sexism that was present in the organization. Because the women including Baker were not generally clergy members, the organization tended to favor them in behind-the-scenes roles that contributed to the day-to-day operations of the organization, as well as to provide emotional and economic support. Therefore, few women became notable in the organization, though a notable exception to that would be Ella Baker. However, she did not necessarily agree with this charismatic approach, and drawing upon her belief in group leadership, Baker convinced college students to form SNCC and adopt its egalitarian power structure where all members could be influential regardless of their gender. So there you can see a very inclusive feminist approach to ensuring that everybody's stories and abilities are being used. A good example of this would be the use of teachers during the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964. In our readings, we are told of two women who were influential in this particular event. Their names, according to the readings, are Denise and Mildred. Denise was involved in CORE when she was attending school in the North, which she had stated was largely comprised of women. When she moved south, she became involved with SNCC and would participate in the Freedom Summer as a teacher. In this role, she assisted students in giving a voice to their feelings and allowing them to understand the materials while teaching them to love themselves and thus empowering them. In this, we can see her doing a very traditional feminine, nurturing role while still empowering them to become agents of change. In regard to Mildred, she became involved in the civil rights movement while she was a student at Spelman College. Although her original intent was not to become a program director, this was the role she took on when the original program director was gone. And as this role, she was responsible for the behavior of her fellow 24 members and influential in the organizational duties of her chapter of the Freedom Schools. She for example, found places where they could hold the classes and stay, and made so that the relationships between Black locals and white volunteers remained proper so not to cause additional problems. In this way, we can see her as a woman taking on a very important leadership aspect role. In regard to these freedom schools, their pedagogy was very similar to the Highlander folk schools, citizenship schools, with a few notable exceptions. In an effort to address the abysmal education system that was forced upon Black Mississippians, SNCC decided to establish freedom schools in the state. By utilizing Northern white volunteers alongside Black activists, SNCC hoped to use education, which they believed meant the use of facts and the freedom to use them, in order to form the basis of democracy. To do this, students would need the freedom to think, grow, and decide in an environment of academic freedom, which would stimulate intellectual curiosity and critical thinking. Two aspects that were very much lacking in Mississippi schools at this particular point in time. One way the Freedom School hoped to accomplish this was through programmed learning that introduced Black history and would allow people to see themselves as a political entity. This would involve educating them through literacy with the goal of joining the civil rights movement. Here we're going to see a slight difference from the Highlander philosophy, which was using literacy to pass the voting test, while here we see it being used as to become more of an activist in general. However, this does not mean that SNCC and the Mississippi Freedom Schools did not abandon Highlander's philosophy altogether, as they believed that literacy should be taught through using students' own life experiences. Though these freedom schools did teach more math and science, they tended to focus on more civic curriculum that included political, social, and economic forces in society, and this was taught through the use of case studies that caused students to question inequality. Additionally, Black history became part of the curriculum in order to teach the roots of oppression and to instill racial pride. Finally, the freedom schools also included developmental lessons about the history of the civil rights movement. Also similar to the Highlander folk schools, citizenship schools, these classes were very egalitarian in nature. In fact, the teacher was not supposed to lord herself over her students, but rather see them as an equal. Oftentimes, these classes would be taught in a circle with the teacher sitting in the circle in order to facilitate discussion. This was especially useful when teaching humanities, where literature and the arts encourage creativity and forms of self-expression. But perhaps the most important lesson learned by students in the in the Mississippi Freedom Schools was that people genuinely cared and loved them, and that they were special and therefore deserving of a good education and the opportunity to voice their experiences. As I said before, there were some similarities in the Highlander education, but there was also some differences. A notable example was that the Highlander citizenship schools focused on adult education, while the freedom schools tended to focus more on youth education. Although originally it was intended for more high school students, in reality it encompassed little children all the way up into adulthood. But it's important to note that the freedom schools did focus on youth, while Highlander focused on adults. As I stated before, the citizenship schools, such as the one founded by Esau Jenkins, focused on literacy with the express purpose of passing the voting test. In order to do this, lessons tended to focus on reading the election laws of each state that was there, while as opposed to the reading lessons used in the used in the SNCC freedom schools that tended to focus more on a humanities approach rather than simply the bare-bones practicality of registering to vote. Another notable difference between the citizenship schools and the freedom schools was that Highlander required the teachers in the citizenship schools to be locals in the communities in which they were serving. This would allow students to relate to their instructor and also to be empowered that they too can become educated and become leaders in their own communities. Conversely, the freedom schools relied mostly on Northern volunteers. Oftentimes, these were white volunteers as well. However, a major similarity between Highlander citizenship schools and the Mississippi Freedom Summer schools was that lessons needed to be taught through the eyes and experiences of their students, as this method was popularized by Highlander graduate Bernice Robertson. The freedom schools adopted this idea to not have their teachers being positioned as authority figures, but rather as an equal who was also learning from her students. This was a very important aspect for both schools because they wanted their students to feel comfortable. In regard to Black militancy, the ideas of Black power and armed self-defense impacted the civil rights movement, especially in terms of young activists. The turn to Black power resulted from an increased awareness of being Black and the slowness of success of the civil rights movement. They wanted the rights to come about quicker, so to speak. Following Emmett Till's murder, youth experienced an awareness of being Black and a sobering knowledge that they too could suffer Emmett Till's fate. With these images and stories of Till's body and his grieving mother dominating their youth, these people, especially young Black males, saw themselves as Till. They knew that they too could suffer that same fate in a series of what became known as near misses. For example, I forget his name off the top of my head, but there was a key figure in the Black Panther Party that became enraged at the woman that Emmett Till had whistled at because he too felt sexual attraction to her and knew that if he would have acted upon that, he could have been killed as well. Because of this knowledge that they were at risk for violence, the media and news of other violence against African Americans and civil rights activists became real to them. Therefore, upon reaching their teens and early adulthood, some youth became militant after spending a decade observing this violence, especially violence that was directed at nonviolent activists. For example, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who founded the Black Panther Party, sought to form an organization that responded to violence against both activists and ordinary residents of urban communities. Through social reform programs such as the Children's Breakfast Program and protective measures of patrolling the police in order to curb police violence against African Americans, the Panthers sought to empower and protect their communities while combating institutional racism. Additionally, they sought to test lawmakers' commitment to civil rights and equal rights through the enforcement of the Second Amendment. Though many African Americans felt that the Panthers' methods were the only way to enact change, The federal government grew alarmed over its militancy and caused it to be investigated and internally fractured through counterintelligence. So therefore, the party kind of disintegrated, though their influence in empowering Black America and instilling racial pride was key in the civil rights movement. However, it would be a mistake to feel that the Black Panthers were not the only organization to turn militant. In a move away from the grounded utopianism of the past, SNCC came to embrace Black power. Due to internal struggles, overall disillusionment with the slowness of success of its programs, and a lack of protection from violence, leadership shifted from Southern students to Northern students such as Chairman Stokely Carmichael, who were antagonistic to the religious-based utopianism and desired to work with whites that had previously dominated SNCC. Instead, they embraced Black power for liberation. Because of this, SNCC abandoned building bridges with the white community and became inaccessible to white press, and instead cultivated relationships with the African American community. Though, as with the Black Panthers, many Blacks were empowered through this call of racial consciousness and pride, the white community became alarmed at the militancy and feared that the organization was comprised of communist sympathizers. Consequently, the federal government placed it under investigation, and along with internal and external dissent, SNCC failed as an organization, though once again, it would be a mistake to say that it was completely ineffective, as it did instill a lot of pride, though it did little to endear itself with the larger population, and that did curb its effectiveness as a civil rights organization that could enact mass change. Though not necessarily youth organizations, armed self-defense groups also contributed to the militancy of civil rights. For example, following an attack on a Black church and innocent civil rights activists that happened to be there, Korean War veteran Joseph Malleson convinced other veterans to form a protective agency that would defend against the Ku Klux Klan. In this capacity, armed African American men guarded the homes of civil rights activists and white allies, as well as protected them in their comings and goings. Though they did not start violence, the armed defense group struck back when attacked by the Klan. As a result, violence against African Americans decreased because the Klan knew that they could not go about their activities and get away with it, as they would be, in fact, struck down as well through violence. Similarly, the Deacons for Defense sought to protect African Americans from white violence. In addition to providing protection in local communities and for visiting civil rights activists, the Deacons spread beyond their home base in Louisiana to other southern states, though because their membership was largely secretive, it's hard to deduce the exact extent of their reigns. Like the armed self-defense group under Joseph Malleson, they were not into proactive strikes. They would only hit if they were attacked first. Indeed, they also, especially under the leadership of Charles Sims, believed that non-violence was the only way to enact change. Because of this, they desired to protect these activists. Though they were mistakenly labeled as being a group of vigilantes, this particular stereotype about them was absolutely untrue. They were very orderly, they were very organized, and they were not expressly violent in terms of conducting preemptive strikes. However, they did have a menacing image, and because of that, mainstream civil rights organizations had mixed feelings about the Deacons being involved in the motives. Though SNCC and CORE did embrace the Deacons, other civil rights leaders such as Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young felt that they should be excluded. even Martin Luther King Jr. experienced an evolution of sorts with his relationship with the deacons, and especially his relationship with Charles Sims. From allegedly, according to Sims, not believing in him and feeling that weapons had no place at demonstrations, to allowing him and the deacons to participate in the Meredith march. Although Sim would disagree with the use of black power, he considered it more harmful than good. His use of weapons and the deacons' use of weapons for protection deterred violence and furthered the struggle for equality by averting violence, thus allowing more room to act. And I believe that is all I have for this last video, and that is it.